Very good. Then let's get started. Welcome back, everyone, to the next session of Straxferno. So we have reached the second circle of Straxen. I believe in Dante's Inferno, this is where it starts getting more and more grim. But I hope we can maintain the good atmosphere and for a little bit longer, at least until we get to the really gnarly parts that still await us further down in this journey. So today, I'd like to start with a short outline of the low-level plugins to give you some context of what happens next. And then I'm very happy that many of you really took on the homework and made a nice slide or even a pull request for several of Strax functions. And I think all of those Strax functions are actually part also of this reading. So if starting with that, giving you guys a chance to present the slides that you made, if you want to, that would fit really well. And then we could get to the reading themselves if there's any questions about them specifically. And we'll end with a preview of next week as usual. Okay, so before we dive into the different low-level plugins, here's just a small overview of the different jargon that you might have seen, which may or may not have confused you. Some of this hasn't changed for many years in Xenon. Some of it has changed when we went to Strax. So a channel is an independent output of the DAC. So for most purposes, a channel number is just a PMT number, but I've linked here to the channel map, where you can see, I think it's a page from Daryl, just a complete mapping of all of the DAQ outputs. Some of them actually aren't DAQ outputs. They're like added by Strax pretending to be a DAQ output. These are the most important ones. Those are just outputs of our PNTs. Then we've got attenuated channels for higher energy analysis and a variety of monitoring channels. And finally, the two veto detectors. Self-trigger is just a condition for the DAQ to acquire a pulse. That means that the raw signal crosses an ADC threshold. So that crossing is downwards because the signals are down initially, so the amplitude gets less. And that just means that a single channel starts acquiring data. The data that it acquires we call a pulse. So that is a variable length piece of data because it depends on how long the data was below that self-trigger. But it doesn't get loaded into Strax as these pulses. It gets chopped up into a couple of fixed length pieces. We'll get back to that, but they're basically called records. So that is just a fixed length. I think the current length is 110, if I'm not mistaken. And a pulse is made up of several records, but Strax always processes the records. It never sort of builds the pulses again, because that would be a variable length data structure, which would make it a bit slow. Then you've got hits. So that's just a range of time where you exceed the hit finder threshold. So that is currently set to the same thing as the ADC threshold, but we could make it more complicated if we wanted to. And really the hit is just the time where it is above threshold. We don't extend the hits a bit left or right. We used to do that in packs, but not anymore. And a hit is really just in one channel. So it's completely possible for hits to overlap. And this is in fact a good sign because that would mean that it's maybe an S1 or something like that. Peaks, on the other hand, that's a range of time across all channels in a detector. And that's just a region of time where Strax considered this as an S1 or S2 candidate. So they are initially formed from hits. So they're clustered together from hits, but they are extended a little bit to the left and the right. They're non-overlapping, so that it is not possible to have peaks that together claim some time. You can have a peak that ends at a certain point and another peak starting at the same sample, because ends are always considered exclusive in Strax, unless they aren't, and then that should be noted. Peaklets are just candidate peaks. So initially we build peaklets and then they get merged into peaks, and we'll talk about that. ADC counts as a unit of amplitude. The baseline is usually at 16,000 ADC counts. So if the channel goes, we can go lower and lower until 0, where we hit the ADC saturation. You can also go higher, which, yeah, is usually just a noise fluctuation. And I think the maximum amplitude is 16,200 something. Daryl will know the number, but 2 to the power 13 minus 1, something like that. Then you've got photoelectrons, which is another area unit, but this is a unit of area, not of amplitude. Of course, we measure amplitudes in samples of 10 nanoseconds, so you can also make a waveform in photoelectrons, but that would then be like photoelectrons per 10 nanoseconds. You'll sometimes see photoelectrons per nanoseconds used as a unit of amplitude for a peak plot. And our definition of PE, sort of operationally done by the way we do gain calibration, as the mean area caused, I need to stop moving my mouse, otherwise you get a black bar on the screen, caused by a long wavelength photon causing any signal in the PMT. So if the photon hits the PMT but didn't cause any signal, then, well, we don't really know whether that was a photon or not, so then it doesn't contribute. But even if it contributes an underamplified hit, it's part of our definition of what 1 PE means. So if you look at the spectrum of detected hits, their mean will be much higher usually than 1 PE. Not only because there's double photon electron emission, so one photon can actually make, one photon of lower wavelength xenon light can make 2 photoelectrons, but also because sometimes a photon can get underamplified, which means that you get a smaller signal that is then usually below the hit finder threshold, but in the LED calibration, it is part of it. Just a small subtlety to be aware of. So don't expect your hits to be perfectly at 1 area in the mean. Okay, so that was rather boring, but I hope it helps make sense of the things that are coming. And as always, just interrupt me when you have questions, right? Or raise hands, maybe that's even better. If I can see it through the screen share. Okay, so going back to our layout of plugins, last week we discussed everything above peaks, so everything above here. We also just briefly discussed peaks itself, though the code you've read this week. And so last week we saw that these are very small data types, except for maybe these basic peak properties, which are a couple hundred megabytes. This week we're going to look at the lower level data types. So these are quite large. Remember, this table is for a 1 hour Xenon 1 ton run. So that background run, so this was about 33 gigabytes. For Xenon and Xenon N-ton, it will of course be larger, but we don't have a representative data set for background data taking with a weather shield yet. So raw records is sort of the source of this. Then so that's built by the DAQ reader, and then we've got records, which is some data reduction steps are applied. We get to the first candidate peaks, which are found over here. They're classified, they're merged into S2s, and finally the merged S2s and the peaklets together are combined to form the peaks. And this peaks is again not stored on the disk, so it doesn't take up any space, because this combination of these two is very quick to do. We might at some point decide to store it anyway, so that we can delete just all of this maybe more complicated lower level data from the analysis facility, but for now there's really no reason. So here's just again which plugin does what. So as I mentioned, the raw records is made by the DAQ reader, and that determines how do you split the chunks coming off the DAQ. So the DAQ reader will be on the optional reading list for next week. What I mean by safe chunk splits is just that the DAQ produces data in just fixed range chunks, so like 5 seconds, and then 5 to 10, 10 to 15. But it might be that there is a peak exactly at 5 seconds, where there is a break of these chunks. So what the DAQ reader does is it reads a little bit of data from right and left of the break, and then finds a safe place to split the chunk. There are actually a few conditions where it cannot find such a break, in case you have a very dense data, and then it will insert a bit of dead time, but it should be very rare. It also splits the data into TPC, muon veto, neutron veto, and I only show the TPC plugin list here. Then we have pulse processing. That does, so the DQ reader doesn't do any processing. It just transmits the data, doesn't even baseline it. That's done in pulse processing. So we do baselining there. We find hits. I've linked just here the notes from several people describing these algorithms. We cut outside the hits. We do a pulse filtering, at least in Xenon 1-ton processing, not yet for Xenon N-ton, just to compress the pulses from a delta function with a little bit of a tail to really a sharp delta function as much as we can. And very importantly, there's a software high energy veto, which reduces the cuts away the single electron tails and thereby makes the data just, 3 times as small. Again, this is not activated for N-ton yet. And notice that here you have one plugin producing 3 outputs. That's probably the first time you've seen that. That was something that was added a bit later to Strax, so that, you know, for a long time there were like small bugs relating to this. I think I've got them all, but it may still not look 100% intuitive and clean to you. But I hope it's clear what happened. In peaklets, we've got another such situation. We actually find the hits again. That's just because we were lazy to, well, it's not laziness. You could have them as an extra output here, but it would be rather large. And yeah, there's not much reason to do that. It doesn't take that long. I'll show you some benchmarks in a moment. So we find the hits again, and then we do the first clustering in several steps to get the first peak candidates. Those are then classified either as unknown, which should be quite, well, I guess it's not very rare, but it shouldn't be any interesting peaks. It should be peaks that are sort of in between single electrons and weird dark coincidence clumps of some kind. But most interesting peaks should be S1 or S2 candidates. And I say fragment here because the next step, merged S2, will merge nearby peaklets if you have a couple of fragments following each other, starting with an S2. And we'll discuss why this is useful, and you can also click on this note over here to get some more motivation of why that happens. It's basically just so that you can both detect S1s, which are very narrow together, but do not split up low energy S2 signals, which also look like separate sort of clumps. So you get a clump of 1 electron and then another one, but you do want to consider that as one thing. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to detect like 3 electron S2s. That would be bad. And finally, you just need to combine these merged peaks. And so you've now got a list of original peak candidates, and a few of them are merged. So you just want to remove the candidates that were merged and place these merged S2s in their place. And that's all that peaks is doing. Okay. So just to give you a sense of how fast or how slow this is going, this is something I made this morning, which is just, I processed one Xenon 1-ton run. Probably very similar to the one that I showed the data sizes for. And then I just looked at how long did everything take. So in total, it took me 1650 seconds, so like a little bit more than 20 minutes. You can see here that half the time was taken up by pulse processing. Then you've got about 1/8 each of peaklets and just loading the raw records. And that involves a network file system disk access, but also a decompression. And this is a lot of data, so that's why it's a significant part. Saving data involves also compression, so that also takes some time, but it's already much smaller. Then you see here peak positions. So this is now what's left here are sort of the high-level plugins that we looked at last time, and the only one that sort of registers is peak positions, because this runs a neural net that takes a bit of time to evaluate. Now, it can be way more efficient than this, because in this case, I processed everything from scratch. So that means that every time there's sort of 5 seconds of data flowing through all of the plugins. Now this neural net, it would be way more efficient to call it maybe with 5 minutes of data at the same time. And if you reprocess starting from peaks, that is what will happen, because the peaks will be stored in chunks which are of a configurable size and will correspond to much larger pieces of data than the chunks for raw records. Okay, so the most important one is here pulse processing. You can see here the different components, which we'll talk about as we go through some of your presentations in the reading. The main ones here are the pulse filtering, because that does a convolution over the data. So that's obviously expensive. The baseline also needs to modify the data. I was a bit surprised it took this much time, actually. I don't know why. You got the high energy veto, which does just a lot of operations, and then some smaller ones, and quite a lot of overhead here, just because you're dealing with this huge data volume. So every time you need to copy the data, that causes a lot of CPU time lost. And the same you can do for peaklets, though here this is a somewhat smaller part of the chunk, but you can see here some waveform and splitting of peaks take up the most of the time. And find hits indeed is not very much, so it's not that much of a problem to repeat it. So of course, this tells you that if you do processing or analysis, it's better, if you can, to work just with the high-level plugins, because anytime you need to get back to these low-level plugins, you need to redo the large part of this pie chart. It would be much nicer if you can just focus on this small part over here, which has very little data and very little CPU to compute these things. And just as a final statistic, the speed comes out at 50 megabytes uncompressed per core per second. And I once computed this for PAX, so this was probably at a different machine. And this is on a DALI node. So you should probably take this with like an order of magnitude uncertainty. But still, it shows you that this claim that we are order 100 times faster than PAX, that still holds. Okay, let's see, I think that's, I have one more thing. So this is just an example of how these records are stored. So in Xenon 1-tone, or for that matter, in the DIQ, thing is basically delivered like this. So you get a timestamp, a channel number, which corresponds to a P&T number, or some other channel, like a some waveform or a high energy channel, and you get some variable length pulse after it. And to feed it to Strax, the data is actually chopped up into bits. So you, for these three, they'll fall within the fixed length. So maybe we have to pad a few zeros at the end, but nothing really has changed. But for this large one, we have to split it into three fragments, so 3 records. So then the index is updated. Actually, I should have updated the time here as well, because of course this record does not start at the same time as this record. It starts later. Okay, any questions about that short intro?
So one question.
Sure.
Those fragments should be 110 samples, right? So they should be equally.
Yes, this is 110 samples. Yes, that's the length of this. Yeah.
So, I mean, just the figure. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Other questions? Okay, then I think we should move on to the work that you guys have been doing. So I ask you to sign up for a function here and to prepare a short slide or to make a pull request. So several people have done this. So we have here quite a few slides now. So what I would say, we also have a few pull requests, not to forget. So what I would suggest is maybe that we go in the order of like low-level algorithms first and then go towards higher-level algorithms. I think it's already roughly in this order. So we got Sophia here, and integrated lone hits. That's pretty low level. Maybe it's good to discuss splitting before merging of the peaks, because that happens sooner. And then we got some waveform which happens even before splitting. So move that here. And Okay, so here's some more more low-level stuff which we could move to the beginning. Okay. I think that would make sense. Yeah, I would just like to give everybody who made a slide, give him or her a chance to tell a bit about what you did. If you really got nothing to say, then that's fine too. Then the slide is already a good reference. And at the end, there's a nice, or as we get to peak splitting, Tim made a nice pull request that actually adds a unit test, which I think will be good for everybody to see. So I would propose that we do that. We just start here with Sophia on baselining, and then as we get to after peak splitting, we go to Tim's test, and then just continue on like that. Does that sound good to everyone? Hearing no objection, I will move on. Okay, let me just put this on full screen over here. Sophia, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. So I looked at the baseline function in Strax and I linked the spot to it where it says here if you want to take a look. But basically what it does is it takes records and you can see kind of what it would take originally on the left-hand plot. And the options you give it are the number of baseline samples, or the samples that are used to compute the baseline, which is just the average of all of those samples at the beginning. So the default is 40. And then you decide whether or not you want to flip the record. Typically we flip it so that we get a positive pulse rather than a negative pulse. So that's the standard. And then we have some other optional settings like allow sloppy chunking, which I think was used if you're missing the 0th record, you kind of set some assumptions for what the baseline would be since you can't compute it. But that doesn't really happen as far as I can tell too much. So it's pretty rare.
What do you mean exactly with the missing the 0th record?
Yeah, so if you don't have, so typically we get a 0th record, like everything shown here is a 0th record. Sometimes you might say you don't have it, like I don't know where it would go missing or something, but if you don't have the 0th record, then yeah, thank you. Then it'll look like 1 in the bottom right over here. So you don't have a baseline to compute. So you have to just assume, you know, a typical standard, I think it's 16,000 as your baseline value to subtract because you don't have any nice quiet samples at the beginning to calculate that. Does that kind of make sense? So that'd be if we were missing the 0th.
I understand. So
Okay.
This is the fragment, no? The first fragment.
Right, yeah, the first fragment, but you can't find the 0th, then that's what you do. But typically we have the 0th fragment and we always save what the 0th fragment's baseline is as well, and then use that baseline to subtract off of the first and subsequent fragments. So this is just a backup in case we don't have that. And then the assumption we make, because we do that kind of subsequent baseline calculation on the 0th fragment and then apply it to the first and so on, this means that we need to save the records in order of time. So they're also kind of chunked together in order of the PMTs, but per PMT, you need to see them in order of time in order to do this right. And so what happens is we compute that baseline. We also compute the standard deviation, which I have shaded in red. You subtract it, which is shown in the second plot. So now we have a negative pulse, but the baseline is around 0. And then if you flip, you just flip it. So now we have a positive pulse. And yeah, that's done for all of the waveforms on the post-processing step.
You just mentioned, I've not understood, you have, they are time ordered in each channel, or you have a unique time ordering for all the channel and channel are mixed together?
I think there's there is some order of the channels, but I don't know if it's like you don't have in a chunk of records all, you know, from channel 256 or something. So you do get a mix, but the important thing is that per channel that they're ordered in time. So for one channel specifically, like say channel 49 or whatever, whichever one I'm looking at, you're always going to see each channel's chunks in order of time.
My question
That's
was
for
if-
the, maybe to just add to that, so the DAQ reader takes care of this, that you have all the records always sorted by time, just like it takes care of the, that this sloppy chunking is needed. So we sort first by time and then by channel. But the need for this function, it only matters that you could have done the reverse, that would have been fine too.
Yeah, I was
on,
just
go
wondering
ahead,
if
Matteo.
I was just wondering if from the DAQ you get them already channel by channel separated and for each channel time ordered, or you have to do let's say this task yourself.
So the DAQ reader takes care of this. The DAQ does output time ordered things, but there are many DAQ readers. But we can get into that next time, maybe when we have the DAQ reader on the list.
The DAQ does not output strictly time ordered stuff. Like within a chunk, you can have a random ordering just based on a wide variety of reasons. But if a data is supposed to go into a specific chunk, it will be somewhere in that chunk.
Okay,
It is possible
thanks for
to
the
get,
correction, yeah.
it is possible to get data that you would expect at the end of a chunk to show up at the beginning, but it will be in that chunk somewhere.
Thanks, Daryl. That's good to know. For Strax, as you see anything in Strax, it is sorted by time. So yeah, we do take care of that. Johan, you had another question?
Yes, so I wondered, how do we know that it's always safe to use the first 40 samples for the baseline? Where in the processing chain do we reserve this slot for knowing that there's not going to be anything interesting in it?
This is something that's set in the DAQ, is we specify how much data comes before the trigger. So that, if there is something in these first 40 samples, it is not high enough to cause a trigger.
So we always write like 70 samples before we do trigger.
I forget the exact number. It's 0x19 words, which is, I don't know, 40 something samples.
So this should be safe as long as the self-trigger threshold is set correctly. Okay, if there's no further questions on baselining, then I would suggest we move on.
For LED data, just one last, you also say the 41st. Because that's not self-trigger, right? So how you said
So for LED data, it's a little bit different. This is based so that where exactly the signal that we're interested in the LED data falls in the window is something that we set with the PMT group. We come up with the number that they want, and then we kind of tweak around timings such that it shows up roughly around there. But it's something that we have complete control over for LED data.
There's a separate processing chain, which we're not discussing here. Well, chain, there's a special plugin that Giovanni has made.
Can I ask?
Francesco, you also had a question.
Yeah. To define the baseline, usually should be the average of the waveform, right? At the beginning. It's better to use the median instead of average. It's much more safe, I think.
Yeah, we did actually use the median in packs. It's a bit more difficult to compute. You would have to then keep more samples in memory. It would be slower to do. So yeah, that would be safer, but we don't currently do it.
So slow down the process.
Yeah, that's one thing. Another thing is that if there's no outliers, then the average can actually be more accurate than the median, because the median is restricted to finite ADC counts. probably that, again, not something that really matters, but you can imagine a baseline constantly being at 0.25 or something. And if you have the median, then you have some bias because it always clips to 0 then. And the average would get that correct, at least on average.
Okay, thank you.
But if you would have a big fluctuation, it will also cause a trigger by itself, right? So by the threshold, you already are restricted to a quite narrow range for ADC counts.
Oh yeah. Of course, the trigger, the waveform should be below the trigger in any case. Otherwise, it's a trigger.
Yeah.
Concerning this, I have a question on our trigger. Is it only on one side or on both sides? So if you have an under fluctuation, would this cause a trigger, or you would?
We trigger only on the falling edge.
Okay, so
we do not trigger on the rising edge.
So it can happen that in the baseline fall a case in which you have peak in the opposite direction due to noise, for example.
So technically, yes, it's possible, but the digitizers do dynamic baseline calculation, so effectively it cannot happen.
And that's also why one of the reasons why we store the 1 sigma. Right, so if there is a very large fluctuation here, you will see that something is off in this record. So there will at least be some record of this happening that you could take into account with your hit finding if you want. Okay, I think we should move on. Thanks, Sophia, for the baselining presentation.
Yep, I also just wanted to mention what Daniel said in the chat, which is we subtract the integer. So it's not a float, I assume, because it's easier to store integers, but yeah. That's just one caveat, but yeah, that's it.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that'll be important for other functions down the line because they need to keep in mind that not all of the baseline was subtracted. Yeah, thanks.
Right.
Okay, so then we get to find hits. So we don't see a name. Make this slide.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Daniel.
No, okay, perfect. So I added it. Okay.
You would have been the prime suspect anyway, so.
Yes. Yeah, I just quickly added it since I have seen that no one was interested in doing it. Find hits is doing actually what says it searches for hits, and as Jelle already introduced in the beginning, there's nothing special about it. So on the sketch on the right-hand side, you see basically how it's done. You define a certain threshold indicated in red, and all samples which have an equal or higher value than this threshold are considered to be within this hit region. What I also indicated with this left and right edge is already what also Jelle said, that the right edge is exclusive. I think there's not much to add. We compute plenty of stuff. You can also go briefly through the stuff I wrote. Maybe interesting to mention is that we have 2 types of threshold. One is a fixed ADC threshold, which is the same as for the digitizers. And there is a second type of threshold, which is a height over noise threshold, which is computed based on the baseline RMS. So it's a multiple of the baseline RMS. And depending on which threshold is larger, we apply the corresponding threshold to the data. One last thing, if you have a hit at the end of a record, which would extend into a next fragment, it gets chopped at the end of this fragment, basically. So the second hit really stops there. And if you have, again, in the subsequent fragment, a sample which is above this threshold, then you would also start there. Second hit. If not, yeah, the hit would end here anyway. So.
Any questions about the hit finder? You also have a detailed notes on the hit finder, which is linked here. Okay, thanks. Then let's move on to cut outside hits. So Francesco, if you're online, would you like to say anything about this function?
Yeah, there is actually not much to say because it pretty much does what it says. As Danny said, the heats is you define what is the left and the right of the heat. So the beginning of the heat and the end of the heat. Whatever is outside of the heat, so whatever is not a heat is not of interest. It's just more data that we are storing. So what we do is that we just save the data, the 20 nanoseconds before the beginning and 150 nanoseconds after the end of the heat. This is at least the default, but it can always be changed, just giving us an option in pulse processing. And the core of the function is done by this helper function, which I guess it's because Numba doesn't like the other function. And yeah, I think this is more or less everything.
Thanks, Francesco. Any questions on cut outside hits? So maybe I can just mention something that we recently fixed. So these extensions, so left and right of the cut outside hits, it's important that those are the same as the peak extensions, or at least they're not smaller. Otherwise, the peak extensions are somewhat weird, right? So these extensions exist because our PNT waveforms have this longer tail. So if you weren't to do this, then you would miss. This very nicely illustrates it. You would miss this area. So you would have a systematic bias for low energy signals, because in high energy signals, there's so many of these stacked together that you would anyway integrate it. So that's why you need this extension. And you also need that extension then in the peak finding later, where hits get clustered together. So you want those settings to be equal. And until recently, we didn't do that. So that caused actually some problems. And this function does also take into account that a hit may be at the end of a record, but the extension falls into the other record, and that is fine, then that will be kept. So even though hits themselves end at records, that doesn't, this extension does take into account the fact that there may be another record right after it. We don't zero that just because it's the start of a record. Thanks, Francesco. So let's move on to integrate lone hits. So Daryl, would you like to say something about this?
This function, again, is kind of exactly what it says on the tin. You can see where it's implemented and where it's called, at least based on the version that I have to have locally on my laptop, which I think is up to date. The arguments that this takes, it takes the hits that are not contained in some peaklet. It also takes records, it takes peaklets, your left and right extensions, which Jelle just mentioned, and then also the number of channels. And then for every lone hit, it finds the peaks, the peak that comes before it, the peak that comes after it. And then it finds, then it goes left until it either finds the start of the record, the left extension limit, or the end of the peak that comes before. And it does this equivalent thing on the other side, and it just integrates between those bounds. So the only thing really interesting is basically finding the nearby peaks and then looking around to see how far it can actually integrate safely.
Yeah, thanks, Daryl. So any questions on this function?
Can you be a little bit more explicative? So at this stage, we have already the peaklets, and basically this address only the hits that have not been assigned to any peaklets, right?
Those are the lone hits, yes.
Yes, we're in a different plugin now. Until now, we've been seeing functions that are here. Now this is one of the functions that are in peaklets.
And how do you decide if it goes to the next or the previous?
What do you mean if it goes to the next or previous? I don't understand.
So what is, if I got it right, it decide to these long hits to which peaklets belong, or they keep them separate from all the rest? What is the goal of this algorithm, plugin?
This algorithm wants to make sure that we aren't double counting area. So if you have the tail of one peak extending into what we would normally consider to be part of a lone hit, we want to make sure we don't double count this area.
Also the other, sorry. Also the other thing, so for the hit finding, you only integrate what is considered to be the hit, this, let's say, core region of a hit. While with this lone hit integration, you also include the left and right extension and also integrate over those areas.
Yes, that's an important addition. That's one of the reasons why this was added. It was a very late addition, actually. I can understand your confusion, Matteo, because we didn't discuss find hit peaks. So this is what you do after the peak finding. We didn't actually discuss the peak finding. We'll get to the discussion of the reading at the end, and then you'll see where this is placed regards to the other things. But yeah, indeed, the purpose of this of the algorithm is to make sure that the area computed for these hits is correct. For normal hits, they're part of a peak. So as long as you integrate the peak correctly, you're good. And the peaks have this extension, but the lone hits do not. And that's what this function takes care of. I saw a few other people raise their hands, but now I can't see anymore who they were. So can you just speak up if you raised your hand? Again, I would have to exit the screen share. Oh no, here's the participants button. Okay, yeah, I don't see any more hands. Okay, good. Thanks, Errol. So now we get to some waveform. Who made this slide?
I did it. So this sum waveform is also again doing what its name suggests. It's basically computing a summed waveform, but this is not as straightforward as one may think, since if you simply take this image on the right-hand side and you have now these different types of pulses and you want to sum them up to a summed waveform, you might end up with something with a variable length. So in our case, we don't want to have that, and this is why the summed waveform function is made out of basically two functions. And the first one, you can also again here go through these points, but let me just go maybe really briefly through it. So you start with this first point, you produce a buffer which is twice as long as the longest peaklet in your current chunk of data. So this is just a buffer where we first want to compute our summed waveform, and later we check that all summed waveforms have the same length. So what we do then is starting over all peaklets, and when we loop over all peaklets, we check, we get the peaklet time, which I indicated in this upper figure as p time, and you get something like the length of the peaklet. And so now you need to know which records are belonging to this peaklet. So what you do, you start looping over all records, starting from a point which is called in the plugin left RI. This makes sense because imagine now once you have finished with one peaklet, you don't want to loop again over the very same records you just did, because everything is time sorted. You can simply start with a higher record index of records which you already looped over. So what you do now, once you found a record which is in your peaklet, you check how many samples are actually overlapping with this peaklet. This is computed as something called shift, and then you check if if there are samples, so how many samples are in the current record, or what could be happen if there is any record sample at all in the peaklet. And this was first quite confusing to me, because before we checked, okay, why is a record in, we checked that the record is in the peaklet, and since all records should be sorted by time, the next one should be also in the peaklet. But this is shown in the lower figure. It can happen that this is not the case. So consider you have this peaklet again, indicated by this bar, and then you have the first record, the uppermost record, which is now within, where the end time of this record is within the peaklet. And now you have the next record fragment, which is just this tiny part without this purple addition. This record end is not in the peaklet. And so this is, I think, also a nice showcase for a typical pitfall you can have these lower level plugins, where you always have to be aware and careful. But after that, it's kind of straightforward. So you get the indices of the overlapping parts, so which samples in the record are overlapping with which samples in the peaklet, and then you just sum it up there. What you also do, there's a check, and I marked this as everything which I marked as wrong is something I have also in the end questions about, because I was a bit confused why it is like that. So we do a check how many channels are actually saturated, and at the moment it's simply asking if the maximum value in the waveform is larger than the baseline value, and this is something. So the saturated, if a channel is saturated, this should be a fixed value, right? It should be, I don't know, 2 to the power 14 or something like that. I don't know. So this was something I found a bit weird. So what you then do is the usual stuff. You add the float part to the, since we want to have the data in PE per sample, we convert it into PE. We add the float addition, which we have not subtracted during the baseline subtraction, to the data, and store everything into this first buffer. But as I said, since we don't want to have something with a variable length, we always want to have things with a fixed length. We call a second function, which is called store downsampled waveform, which uses the peaklet, the current peaklet, and the summed waveform buffer as argument. And if you go to the next slide. So what it does, basically, it checks what is the maximum allowed length of a summed waveform, which we allow, which is, I think, by default 200 samples. And then it compares the length of our current buffer with this length. And if the current buffer is smaller, then we are fine. We just copy the data. If the summed waveform buffer has a piece of waveform which is longer than these 200 samples, what we need to do, we need to downsample it. And what we do here, and this is a crucial thing, I think, is that we made an example. For example, consider if we have a waveform which has 446 samples. We do a seal divide. So we round up basically after division, which means that our current waveform is a factor of 3 larger than what we would allow. So what we do is we divide our current waveform by this factor of 3, but this time we do floor division to ensure that we always make, when we downsample, our waveform a little bit smaller rather than larger, because otherwise we could get overlapping peaks, which we do not want to have. So in our example case, this means that we say, okay, our new waveform is 148 samples long, and this is some place where we really lose information now, because now we only take the first 148 times 3 sample and use this to downsample the waveform. So we always sum up 3 successive samples to a new value. But basically the last float part, these 0.67 sample fraction, is actually lost in the end. And then we just store the waveform and that's it.
Okay, thanks, Daniel. This is one of the most complicated functions in Strax. Any questions on this? Matteo?
Yes, sorry if I didn't raise my hand previously. But it's also a little bit, I think it's only on this participant list, so every time it's a little bit uncomfortable to have it
Sure.
this. Do we know with the new data if we will ever care about this downsampling? I mean, at some point, if you downsample too much, you can lose a tiny feature, which I cannot imagine which one it is. So I was wondering if we are afraid that we can lose at some point something, because this will be used also to view the waveform, maybe in a waveform viewer. Correspondingly, why it was not considered to have the same waveform and not downsample and just saved in more fragment in the same way that you are doing with other type of data.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very very motivated question. Indeed, that's the other option that we could have gone for. We went for that with records. I think the answer is that we don't know, but strongly suspect that it is okay. You only hit this downsampling for large S2s, wide S2s, and for them, we don't really need the 10 nanosecond sampling. We need that for S1s. And even there, if you know that our PMTs have waveforms that are 150 nanoseconds wide, it's already doubtful whether we really need our 10 nanosecond sampling, because it's still useful for S1, so we keep it. If we don't like this, what we can always do is we can increase this data length. So this we can always set to like 500. That shouldn't change too much the amount of data stored, and then there will be much less downsampling. But yeah, that's something that we could study. You could reprocess it again with a data length of 2000 and see if any important quantities change. I would be highly surprised, but that's a study you can do. Yeah.
One comment I want to throw in here while we're talking about downsampling, there is a potential crash that I did run into based on the downsampling. So because the DT field is only stored as a signed 16-bit integer, if you downsample too much, that goes negative because of integer overflow. So if some strange occurrence happens, I would probably blame a muon, and you end up with a sum waveform that is longer than 6.5 milliseconds, Strax crashes.
Yeah,
I found this out the hard way.
6.5 milliseconds that's a good point, Daryl. I think the clustering algorithm should in that case make sure that we indeed do have multiple peaks. And maybe this goes back to Matteo's question. That's another way to achieve it. Just have a hard maximum peak length in the clustering. You would also have that.
Yeah, this was I think on Strax 0.7.3.
Okay.
So it's quite archaic at this point. But sure. So 6.5 microseconds is only a few times longer than the drift length. So a vertical traveling muon will create a signal that is 1 millisecond long, just as all of the electrons drift up. Then you probably have another millisecond or two of photoionization tails. So in the unlikely chance that the ADCs don't go busy, this is actually not impossible to happen. At least for the high energy channels, I expect this to be a potential issue.
Yeah, so we could consider maybe making this a 32-bit integer at some point. Fortunately, it's a higher level data type, so it won't. If we have to change the raw records data type, that would be a problem. But this one we can just do by building the version.
DT is not it's not a high level data field. It's in everything.
Oh yeah, that's true. But we can just change it for peaks. We have to change things a little bit, but yeah.
Or if we make the data length, 300, that buys us an extra 3 milliseconds.
Yeah, something like this. Yeah, good point. It's in general a danger when handling integers that suddenly they become negative if you add too much. If you're used to just working with Python integers, that's a bit of a surprise because they don't have that property. At least not that I'm aware of. Daniel, let me just answer this this question that you had over here about samples being larger than the baseline value. So this relates back to what Sophia showed, to this flipping. So if you have a baseline, so the way this flipping works is what you do baseline minus the data. The ADC saturating point is at 0. So if you do baseline minus the data, then that ADC saturation point will now be at wherever the baseline used to be. So that is, so you're right that it is just a hard thing at 0 output from the digitizer, but where that 0 output has gone to has been affected by this algorithm, and it has moved to the position of the baseline. That's why we check that in that way. Okay.
Okay, maybe I have to think about it. I'm not fully convinced, but
okay, now that's
just let me think a little bit more about it. The second question I had is this: with this twice as long as the longest peaklet, I think this is maybe a remnant of that. In the beginning, you did not consider to make the peaks actually smaller. You made them longer, maybe, and this is just a remnant of that.
Could be. Could also be that for some unexplained reason, I got crashes about the buffer not being long enough. And then I just said, yeah, let's make it twice as long just to make sure that we don't get buffer overflows.
Okay.
But yeah, you're right that we shouldn't have to make it twice as long. That isn't needed. You can try not doing it, but it's a relatively small amount of memory compared to the couple of gigabytes of memory that we use. Maybe one more remark I'll make about this function is that the reason it's so complicated compared to also to the algorithm that we have in PAX is that the much more simpler algorithm, which is just allocate a bunch of zeros and fill in whenever you see a record, that doesn't work because allocating all zeros for the entire chunk would be 5 seconds of 10 nanosecond sampled zeros. That's an awful lot of zeros. So then that just doesn't work for memory considerations. It would be very inefficient as well. So that's why we do this a bit more complicated algorithm. So in view of the time, I would actually suggest that we go through the presentations on peak splitting and merging next time, and also then look at Tim's pull request next time, so that we have this time some time for your questions on the main readings. It would be a waste if you did those readings and then couldn't ask your questions. So I hope that's okay with everyone. I know there's also some people who are still working on their functions, so then they would also have a chance to present next week if possible. Okay, so in that case, let's move on to our readings. So we have two files basically, pulse processing and peaklet processing, and from each of them we looked at the main plugin. So that let me go back to Straxon. So then we get here. So let's start with pulse processing. Okay, so you see a whole long list of options. That's just a preamble for this giant pulse processing plugin. There's a lot of things. Okay, so anybody have any question about this plugin, or want to raise any of the study questions they had a remark or a problem with?
All right. I had a question. So this pulse processing is only being done for the low energy channels. At the moment, we're not doing anything with the high energy data. So right. At what point do we start also doing it for the high energy channels? And can we actually use the same machinery for those pulses?
That's certainly a good point. You're completely right. They're thrown away over here. Here we throw away all the raw records which have the channel to number too high. I hope we can reuse most or some of the similar machinery, but what I would hope even more is that we don't have to, that the only thing we will do with those channels is basically just modify the data from the low energy channels. Of course, that won't be the first thing that we do. Like, first, we need to see if those channels make sense and calibrate the attenuation. But eventually, I hope we can use those channels as a kind of saturation correction, much like in PAX we had a hit pattern driven, sorry, it's both waveform shape driven saturation correction. So there is actually in the records a field. Let's go to the data type. So if I look at the record data type here, this is in Strax D types. There's here a field called amplitude bit shift. So if you set this, then that will tell Strax that the data for this record should be considered, you need to multiply it by 2 to the power of this number. I think this is an idea that Chanyu worked out. And this allows you to get around this limitation that Daryl mentioned, basically, that you have an integer overflow if you store 2 large values. So in that way, we can work with the 16-bit data still, but we can set this value, rescale everything, and then just fill in the little bit where the digitizer was saturated. And then we don't need to worry about the high energy channels after that. I hope that's the future, but that's certainly not the present. At the present, you're right, we just throw them away.
Are they actually thrown away? Because so does pulse processing actually depend on raw records high energy or just raw records?
You're right, it just depends on raw records. So they're not even...
It doesn't even make it there.
You're right, the DQ reader splits it out. I think it didn't used to do that. Maybe that's why I was confused. So yeah, it doesn't throw them away here. They're just moved into a different data type that is not loaded. Yeah, thanks, Daryl. So I guess this thing is not needed anymore.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. Maybe we could think about some training for that. Like if Peter and Tianyu can think about how to simulate in Waveform simulator, then we can test this feature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, just to check that everything is correctly written in, that the areas are correctly reconstructed. Yeah, I agree. And a similar thing would apply to the waveform shape-driven saturation correction. You can also implement it in a similar fashion with this bit shift field.
But eventually that will not be completely, let's say, replaced, because there are 2 types of saturation which that the attenuation doesn't help. But I hope that this will be able to help us identify more channels that can be used for waveform shape reconstruction.
Yeah, so you mean that not all channels have this high energy output? That's true. And then I guess if you
desaturate... No, what I mean is that if the PMT signal is already distorted due to the large pole, then you cannot use it, even if the amplitude is not saturated.
Yeah, you're right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, this only helps against ADC saturation. Okay. Other questions about pulse processing, or did you want to follow up, Johan?
No, thanks for the reply.
Okay. Let's see, Matteo, you raised your hand.
No, I didn't. Do I have to remove from
there's a blue thing next to your...
It stayed from the time before.
Yeah,
you can also lower your hand.
Okay.
Thanks.
This is very... I have to open every time this participant, and
Yeah, same for me. When somebody raises the hand, I get a little pop-up. But if more than one person does it, then the pop-up just says, "Well, many people raised their hand." So it's not great. Anyway, any other questions about pulse processing, the stuff that we read? Right. So did anyone identify two pieces that could be interchanged, for example? It's one of the study questions. For example, we do the software high energy veto here, but we do the hit finding here. Could we swap those?
One could, but wouldn't you prefer to throw away as much as you are going to throw away rather before than later? Because there's less raw records after the high energy veto, so find hits will be less work.
Yeah, exactly. We certainly could, but it would just be wasted effort, basically. That's why this software high energy veto is so early. So here's an interesting one. Could we swap this? So we have here a filter to make the PMT pulses nice, sharp.
Sorry, one question. Could
Yeah.
you really change those two? I mean, then you would have hits where you have no data anymore, isn't it? If I search first for hits and then do the beat.
Yeah, then you'd get into some problems later. That's right, Daniel. So you could do it. I guess that would work fine. But then you get to cut outside hits and then it says, hey, I don't have the right record anymore. So yeah, you'd have to modify more things than just switching these things around. You're right. Good point. So how about these two? So you have here filter records, which makes the hits into nice delta functions, if it works right. And here you have find hits, which is looking for excursions. So maybe that's good, right? Oh, I see. I give the answer away in a comment. So that's terrible. Never comment your code. You can't use it for courses anymore.
No, you can't.
Yeah, no, you can't, because this messes with the signal noise ratio. So you get if once you filter, the signal noise ratio goes down. So yeah, and you can also do a filter to try to improve the signal noise power, but that's not the kind of filter that we're doing here. You could do two filters, and then have a more advanced hit finder, but we already have a pretty good SP acceptance, so we didn't consider that. Okay, there's much more in this this file, so I think the reading stopped here, but there's also an entire piece of code here for the software high energy veto. There's something about pulse counting. If you're interested in that, you can have a look. Okay, if there are no more questions on this one, then let's move on to peak processing. Or peak-led processing. We, of course, discussed peak processing last time already. Johan, you had a question.
Yeah, so we, in this line 19, we set a minimum peak number of 4 PMTs.
Yes.
But then later, and I don't know exactly which line anymore, we require a coincidence requirement of 3 PMTs. Does that still make sense?
Okay, let's see, where can we find this other line where we require 3? Are you referring to the tight coincidence, perhaps?
Yes, sorry.
Okay, okay. So that's a good point, actually, because there's 2 different notions of coincidence. So when we search for peaks, there's a certain gap that we assume. So we basically group hits together unless they're spread by more than a certain gap, and that gap is configured here, 350 nanoseconds. So if you have a hit, then there's nothing for 200 something nanoseconds, and then another hit that's coincident enough to become part of a peak. So this is done with single electrons and S2s in mind. If you want to classify S1s versus S2s, what you're interested in is how many hits are really close together. So you're interested in the tight coincidence. So how many hits are just like a few samples apart. So that is the tight coincidence variable. And for that, there is a threshold that if 3 or more are there, then we make it an S1. So you can have a 4 or 5-fold peak. So that's in 5 PMTs, but the tight coincidence is still 0. What wouldn't have makes, I guess what would not have made sense is if we had this equal to, let's see, less than the tight coincidence requirement. Would that have made sense? No, I think that would have not have made that much sense. You would have just identified some, weird dark rate combinations which you're not going to use as S1s. Maybe you want that, but probably you don't.
Jelle, sorry, but
Francesco.
this PM heat, this contribution of PMT, this minimal number of PMT that provide you the signal, right?
Yes, so this is saying that we need to have at least 4 PMTs contributing a hit to make a PMT, to make a peak. So even if you have a million hits from one PMT, that would not make a peak.
Okay, but this is true independent if the PMT, for the 4 PMT are in the same array or in both top and bottom array?
Yeah, there's no condition based on that. We could consider adding that, but currently we don't. Any PMT will do. So even if they're 4 right next to each other, because that could be like an S1 that's very close to the bottom or top array.
Okay.
Yeah. At some point, we take this information into account when we do the pattern goodness of fit computation, or rather, we would if we did that computation, but currently that's not implemented in Strax.
Oh, because wondering if for PMT hitting a different on 2 array can provide you some fake signal instead of a really good one.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Ideally, we have the pattern fit likelihood to answer that for us. It will compute likelihood based on the reconstructed position of the event. If, for example, there's an S2 exactly a maximum drift time later, then it's maybe not so odd because the event is clearly very deep. So it's not so odd that only a few bottom PMT array PMTs see it. Of course, you get a high energy signal of like 50 PMTs seeing it, and all 50 are on the bottom array. That shouldn't really be physical. So that you would then throw that away as some kind of cut later on, but not yet at this stage.
Okay.
Okay. Andrea, you also had a question.
Yeah, thanks. So regarding, I saw there's also a classification for S1 and S2, which is based, it's based on the tight coincidence and the rest time.
Yes.
So there's no request for example, a minimum number of, a minimum area, I guess, right? Is it correct?
Let's see. I think you're right. Well, there's here a condition for area larger than.
This is for if it's larger than 100 photoelectron, it means that the rise time you request is different. It's okay, but on the other side, let's say there's no request for a minimum total area.
Yeah, that's right. So in principle, you could have an S1 with an area of, well, even with a negative area. If you get very unlucky, you have like a hit and then a very large negative noise excursion next to it, and that happens in 3 PMTs at the same time, you would have a negative area. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. No, okay. So, but we have anyway 2 conditions, and so which take into account the shape, the feature of this one. But okay, thanks.
Yeah, so in principle, we could have an area cut as well, but an area cut is also very easy, I think, to do later in the analysis. But sure, this could certainly be one of the conditions we do in the S1 classification. It's better to do it here than as some kind of cut later, unless you've already processed the data and don't want to go back or something, because otherwise you might get like several fake S1s in the event, which will mess up the pairing and do those kind of things. This is also one of the reasons why we made it easier to change these low-level settings. In PAX, this certainly doesn't hold. If you wanted to change the coincidence level or the minimum area for an S1, you had a big reprocessing on your hands, and it would get into a mess. With Strax, that's a little easier.
Oh, okay, thanks.
Okay. Sure. Let's see. Johan, you had another question on peakless processing?
Oh, sorry, I forgot to raise my hand, but I actually do have another one.
That's fine.
So last week we discussed that in Strax you can share options between plugins, but for some reason the hit finder options are treated different from all the other options because, or somewhat different because the hit finder options are declared at one of the two, whereas we don't share them with this Strax takes config.
Yeah, you're right. So the hit finder options, we actually like literally, well, okay, instead of duplicating them, I declare them once here in pulse processing. We have hit finder options here. There happens to be only one hit finder option at the moment, but there can be more if there's, for example, also a noise dependent threshold. Yeah, so this is just a way to declare, just a way to avoid duplication. So we could have just copy pasted this option. That would have worked, but yeah, this just makes sure that they are the same. For other options, there are not that many shared options. I think gain model might be the only, or maybe the channel map, number of CPMTs, things like that. And so this is a very small option that I don't really mind duplicating. But yeah, so it's just a matter of style, basically. Like, do you want to avoid the duplication and the possible mismanagement that comes from it? Or do you say, well, for this number of TPMTs, for example, it's just a small thing, I'll just copy paste it.
Yeah, sure, I didn't know that it was taken, well, it was foreseen to have more hit finder options. Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, that indeed, if it were one option, then maybe it would have been a bit silly. Okay. Aaron, you also had a question.
Yeah, I have a stupid question. So if I want to call this plugin with a different settings, I just have to basically require a new context with the new settings, and then just pass the data, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And so that I also demonstrated this briefly last section, but you can just do get array for your run ID. And then let's say you want, okay, well, I guess I need to reconnect because I put in the cable. But yeah, you can either just add config equals a dictionary and then here say peak min PMTs equals 10. Let's hope my connection is back now. Doesn't look like it. Anyway, this is one way to do it. Then you just get the array with peak min PMTs equals to 10. If you do this for a low-level option, then you might be in for a bit of a wait. You might be better off doing it in a batch job or something. But for this small run, which is just a few minutes, it's fine.
A way to, you can add this to just a short range of data, right? Also.
You can add it to, sorry, what did you say?
Short range of data, like the
to a range of data. Oh yeah, you can ask here for a range of data as well. So you can have one run and then another run and then another run. That is fine. If you intend to use this a lot, another way to do it is to add it here in this configuration dictionary. So we put here peak min PMTs equal to 10. And another way is to make a new context. So you make actually a new context with config equals min PMTs. And then you put that equal to st2, something like this. This is also documented in the tutorials.
That only will work if the option is within Strax and takes config, right?
This only works if the plugin actually takes that option. Well, if you set an option that if I make a typo here, then it will just give me an error, a warning saying, hey, I don't know what that option is.
Thinking about the gain model option. If I want to put a new model, but the only two models that are defined in the context. So I will have to define a new context to put a third model that can have this option.
Okay, so gain model is a bit of a special option. I'll show you that in a moment. Let me just show you the part in the tutorial that I mentioned where this is shown. So we have here in the tutorial, there's this part on configuration changes where you can see how this works. So you can, here we have the passing the config, and here are the other ways. So you can set the config. I didn't even set, this is a slightly neater way to do it. And here's making a new context. Okay, now let's go to that gain model option. So that's a bit of a special one. So special for many ways actually. So here we have gain model. It's not listed here. That means that the default has to come from somewhere else, and that's specified in the main context file, which we'll look at
gain model
in 2 weeks.
Okay.
Yeah, so here you have gain model. So the current gain model is specified by these two strings, 2pe constant, and then here this string. There are actually several gain model types that you can show, and they're processed by a helper function, which is here gainModels.py. So this is the function that will convert your gain model, so 2pe constant and then there's some string, to an actual list of ADC to PE conversion factors. So we'll check first the model type. For example, here it goes to 2pe constant. Then it says, hey, is this some kind of special aliased thing? For example, here, right? Then we'll use that. If not, then I guess you're giving it just some list of uniform channels, some uniform gain list, and then you will use that. So you can specify any gain you want just as that, as 2pe constant, and then the gain that you want. And I guess you can even put in, I guess you can't put in an array yet, but we can change that so that you can put in an array. But yeah, if you want to define a new alias, then you would want to add it to this list. This is an area where Alexander from Zurich is also thinking about, like, how do you make the gain evolution model? And so these things might change a lot in the next few months.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Okay, let's go back to where we were. We were in peak processing, peaklet processing. Tim, you also had a question on peaklet processing.
Yes, we were already talking about the S1, S2 classification, and I read the note, and now I have two questions. One in terms of software. So I read in the note that there's also planned to have a machine learning based classification of S1 and S2, so if I understand correctly. So then in terms of how would this be reflected in terms of plugins? Would you then do a new plugin which then be loaded, or would you add this to the existing structure here? That's the first one. And then maybe a more team B question is, what do you have in mind to do there for machine learning based S1, S2 classification?
Sure. So let me just answer on the software. I think, for example, Faye has worked with this in the past and can give you more sense on what could be done there. So I think the answer is similar to what we saw for the position reconstruction last time. So where there you also have a situation where you could have multiple algorithms. If you just want to develop it, one thing you can do is just make exactly the similar plugin. So outputs the same thing. It provides peaklet classification. You just register it over this plugin. So you just tell the context. It's also shown in the tutorial. That is actually exactly the example that we show at the end. Here there's a new classification. Provide peaklet classification. This is a very stupid classification, which makes everything an S1. So you just register that, and then you can process with that new plugin. I think your question is more like, okay, somebody has made that, has shown that it works. How do we now put it in the software chain? There, I think the one that makes sense is that you have, like we discussed last time, you have sort of one master plugin which will provide peaklet classification, and subsidiary plugins. And the task of the master plugin is just to pick one of them. You can change a config option to say which one it needs to pick. I think that would then be the most robust solution in the end. But yeah, that question will come up once we have a machine learning classification.
Yeah, sure.
So Faye, do you want to add anything about how you could do such an algorithm?
Well, I think that's very good. I think that's what we did, right? And yeah, but as if when new data comes, of course, you can have a few different ways to optimize your classification, and like Andrea's idea of including area is good one. We already demonstrate that it could be very useful with the 1.7's classification, right? So yeah, many ideas can work, and eventually you can use it. I mean, you can use the data to prove that this can improve it. Then we gradually put into the main chain as Jelle is showing.
Okay, thanks, Faye. Let's see, we're nearing our time here. So Aaron, did you have a brief question on Piclet processing still, or? Your hand is still raised. Can you hear us, Aaron?
Oh, sorry, I forgot to lower my hand.
No problem, no problem. It's just the exercise of keeping the hand out.
Sorry.
Okay. Right, so then since we're almost near the end, let me just give you a short preview of what we're going to discuss next time. Thanks for your questions and your nice presentations. So we'll continue with that next time. So if you haven't yet signed up for a function, then please do so and have a look through it. Most of those functions that are left are sort of smaller helper functions. We may not go through all of them, like may not be completely relevant, but it's a good exercise to just dig into one algorithm, see how it looks. So next time we'll start with a few more presentations, the ones that we didn't get to this time on the peak splitting and merging, and then we'll get to loading data and mini analyses. So this will be the first lesson where we'll get into Strax rather than Straxen. You'll read the code for let's see here, get array and get data frames, the functions that actually give you data, and make also, which just doesn't give you the data back. And we'll look in the concept of mini analyses. Now, mini analyses were kind of something that we added as an afterthought at the end. So that's also why they're sort of in Straxen. They're sort of like a plugin in the sense that it's a small contained bit that does a bit of analysis, but unlike a plugin, it doesn't output something every couple of seconds, every chunk. It outputs only one thing for a run. So that's very useful to make, for example, a plot, or to make maybe a single computation for, I don't know, some kind of average or some kind of yield or something you want to determine. So you'll look at the code for the mini analyses, and a very simple plot mini analyses. Things like waveform watching and so on are all implemented as mini analyses. So if you're interested in that kind of area, that would be good to look into. I also have the DIQ reader here as an optional reading element. I would suggest, if you're interested in the DIQ, read it, but otherwise maybe skip it because it's quite a bit technical. And I don't think we'll have time to discuss it next time, since we also have the presentations and mini analyses and loading data. Okay, so that's all I had to say for this week. Any questions about next week's reading, study questions, exercises? I guess you'll see it when you get to it. Okay, then let's end the meeting for today. See you guys next time.
Thanks, bye.
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 Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.